So I've been reading Bulwarks of Unbelief by Joseph Minich, and I've been thinking a lot about it. And he argues that the absence of God, or the perception that God is absent, is a misunderstanding of God's silence. And the reason that atheism is plausible is because the Industrial Revolution has changed our perception of reality so that we perceive God as absent instead of silent. And atheism is plausible because of the way we perceive the world, and the way we perceive the world has been changed by the Industrial Revolution. And it's a fantastic book, and I wanted to just think a little more today about the way in which the Industrial Revolution changed our perception. And if I could put it in my own words, I think the Industrial Revolution created a sort of a type of diffused agency, so that as we gained more power over nature, and it's kind of measured, you can kind of measure that power we have over nature in the increase in creature comforts. As we gain that power over nature, we at the same time become more passive and less attentive consumers / users of that power. So it's there's a strange contrast. As we gain more power to control and manipulate nature, at the same time we become more passive by being less attentive to that power and to the reduced level of participation. So that's the idea that I want to explore, and it's kind of given me sort of a fresh or a new appreciation for the Industrial Revolution, and I kind of want to explore and dig into that idea in this video. And I think with the and by the way, agency, what I mean by agency is the ability to interact with your surrounding world. And the Industrial Revolution, it's a big topic, and so I'm just sort of skating across the surface. And it's so often talked about in respect of its impact and the way in which it's changed the world. One of the episodes about the Industrial Revolution on The Rest is History is a lot of fun to listen to, and sort of a great introduction to this topic. And they emphasize the importance of the Industrial Revolution and the way in which it's had this global impact. Kind of predictably, Dominic Sandbrook wants to comment on the environmental impact, and that's partly, obviously sparked renewed interest in the Industrial Revolution recently. But probably what's more interesting is what Tom Holland highlights, and that is the impact on people and the way people experience the world. So it's It's episode 108. So if you look it up in the Rest is History catalogue. And Dominic Sandbrook starts with a quote from Thomas Carlyle, the historian Thomas Carlyle, who describes the Industrial Revolution is characterised, or this time period is characterised by the single epithet, the mechanical age, the age of machines, where nothing is done by hand. So there's that's a great kind of description of the change and the way in which we are changed by the Industrial Revolution. What I might do is I might just throw a timeline up here of some of the key events that I think both represent and demonstrate this change. So there's lots of things you can talk about with the Industrial Revolution. For example, you can research cotton output, or you can go back a few steps and compare the industrial output of England, beginning with sheep, and then lead, and then cotton, and then coal, and of course there's all these other secondary historical effects from that. So you can measure those things. They sort of objectively, you can measure the impact of the Industrial Revolution. But I think what's more interesting, that tells you the scale. That gives you a sense of the scale of the Industrial Revolution and how big it is historically. But probably what's harder to talk about and harder to measure is its subjective impact, the way in which it's changed our perception. So what I thought I'd do is I'll put the timeline up that side maybe, and just highlighting a couple of these key things: the Cromford cotton mill, the Stockton-Darlington railroad carrying passengers on the 27th of September, Faraday inventing the electrical engine, and then that great quote from Endeavour Morse. Researching this, I didn't know that was his first name, Endeavour. Endeavour Morse sends this telegram on the 24th of May in 1844 from Washington DC to Baltimore, and the first, and I think this is a great line. The first telegram is, "What hath God wrought? What hath God wrought?" And then thinking about perception, I mean, you could throw in markers, other inventions, and you could throw in sort of things that lead up to it. But one other thing I'm highlighting on here is Bazalgette's underground sewerage system. So it's this massive engineering feat to provide this unified sewerage system for London after the Great Stink. It's great. It's a fantastic name. So after the Great Stink, then Bazalgette changes the perception, the way people would live and smell and experience the city of London. And then because of one thing I want to talk about a little bit later on, in 1866, the first transcontinental, so connecting two continents in the world, telegraph cable is put down between England and America in 1866, connecting the continent, Europe, with North America. Now, interestingly, this all sort of takes place during the reign of Queen Victoria, and she's her dates are 1837 to 1901, and so in a way, the Industrial Revolution that's the key characteristic of her reign. I mean, there's obviously impacts for the Commonwealth and for global history and all sorts of other things, but that Victorian period is the period of history we're talking about. Now, obviously, there's lots of things produced and there's lots of secondary historical effects, but if you think about the way we experience the world, clothing changes, the sensation of material, travel changes, the ability to go from one place to another. I've got an interesting quote about that and the way you perceive the place where you live and other places. A quote about that coming up. Communication and news, and even smell, even sewerage, things like that. So there's this perception of the way those mechanical, technological changes the way we perceive the world. Let me read a quote from history. I found this at a book sale. History of England. This is covering the Victorian period by Peter Ackroyd, and this one, volume 5, is called Dominion. It's about the Victorian period, and he's talking about the Industrial Revolution, and he uses, to describe it, thinking about other great phrases, "What hath God wrought?" Well, there's another phrase that summarizes the effect, the psychological, subjective effect of the Industrial Revolution, and that is the annihilation of time and space. The annihilation of time and space. So no longer is the distance that you have to travel by foot or by cart or horse, or the fact that news takes a long time, or that goods take a long time to get to you, all of that is annihilated in the Industrial Revolution. He's talking about, in this quote that I want to read, he's talking about some amazing statistics about the increase in railroads from the beginning of the 18th century to the end of the 18th century. So between 1844 and 1849, more than 3,000 miles of tracks had been laid, and the number of train journeys had risen from 33 million to 60 million. So lots more people are experiencing this travel differently. And then he says at the bottom of page 78, the traps and the gigs, the flies, the chariots, the fantions, the wagonettes, the dog carts, and the Whitechapels were soon things of the past. But what was the point of speed? William Cobbett met a countrywoman who had never in her life gone beyond the boundaries of her parish. And he goes on and describes more of this sort of contrast between people that had only experienced sort of their local world, and the way in which the Industrial Revolution changed that. It had become, and this is now continuing on page 79, it had become what Carlyle called a mechanical age, of which the characteristics soon became evident. It encouraged uniformity and anonymity. And it encouraged decorum and restraint. You often think about that when you think about the Victorian period. And it was an age of quickness of action and reaction. Quick at meals, quick at work, quick at dressing. And looking deep into the Thames, you might see a tunnel already 4 years in the making, attended by diving bells. Look up and you would see hydrogen balloons in the sky. And soon there would be no more exhausted horses and drunken postboys, etc. And just over the page, there's just one more little bit, page 80. Ralph Waldo Emerson in English Traits, 1856, observed that mines, forges, mills, breweries, railroads, steam pumps, steam ploughs have operated to give a mechanical regularity to all the habit and action of men. The steam engine became the metaphor of the age, and there were many discussions on the notional benefits of men operating like machines. Well, that would be progress. And he goes on to observe that during the 1800s, there's this interesting shift from sort of electricity being sort of strange and unusual. Think Frankenstein, where the sort of the monster is animated by the forces of electricity, so brought back to life, and sort of machines and those sorts of things are displayed along sort of other cultural artifacts that don't make sense together. But by the end of the 1800s, by the turn of the century, by Federation 1901, the end of Queen Victoria's reign, it's become much more commonplace. The world is experienced and described differently. I'm using as the cover image for this video that painting, oil painting by Turner, and what's it called? It's Wind, Rain, Steam and Speed, the Great Western Railroad. And it's this style of painting to convey emotion, but he was painting during this period, and to us it seems unremarkable, like a train. Why would you paint a train unless you're sort of a train enthusiast? But he's not seeing it like that. He's seeing it as the way in which this speeding train is conveying emotion and distance. And I've got someone at the church door, so I'm just going to pause and I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. And before I play some clips from a documentary hosted by the guy who was Baldric in Blackadder, Tony Robinson, and he's doing these historical documentaries, and he's done an episode on the Industrial Revolution. So I want to play some clips from there. But just before I do, a quote from Joseph Minich. Minich? I've got to learn how to pronounce his name correctly. And talking about the way in which this change in relationship to nature, this mechanical change, and then the system that goes along with it. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a sec, but there's this is the... Let me just read the quote. So he's quoting from Jacques Ellul. If Ellul is right, It shapes us to expect any answer to have the feature of techne itself. Predictable, rational, efficient, order. And so Jospeh Minich is talking about the expectation of efficiency and looking at using the theorist Jacques Ellul to explore this topic. So underneath this mechanical control of nature is this expectation that that's the way the world works, that the world works in a mechanical way, and then we expect it to work in a mechanical way because the system that supports all this production and all this machinery has these inbuilt assumptions and perceptions. But I'm going to play a couple of clips of Tony walking through the Derwent Valley, which I now understand why in my hometown, Hobart, home city of Hobart, it was located in the Derwent Valley, and I understand why that's significant now. But he's doing this little walking tour, and he stops at a place in Cromford where the first mill begins, and then he talks about the mill and then talks about the railroads. And so I'm just going to play some clips about that.
Into Cromford Mill. The place had an impact that would change the way we live.
Richard Ackroyd was the youngest son of an artisan family from Preston. I say youngest, one of 13 children. And he was apprenticed to a wig maker at a young age. And one of the jobs he had was to travel around the country buying hair, because the best wigs were made from real hair, and women's hair in particular. He came across a number of people who were trying to find a means of mechanising the whole process of spinning.
With a growing interest in engineering and invention, Ackroyd was fascinated by these ideas. Conventional spinning machines needed a skilled worker to produce just a single thread. But by 1768, Ackroyd had designed this, the spinning frame, a machine that needed no skills and could spin multiple threads at once. At first, it was the familiar power of horses that drove the spinning, but the founder of Cromford Mill was looking for more power, much more power, 24 hours a day.
Is it fair to call this the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution?
Well, I think so, because you're standing in the first water-powered cotton spinning mill in the world. And of course, the ideas that Ackroyd perfected here extended throughout the country, some 200 Ackroyd mills eventually operating by the end of the century, and of course transferred also to France, Germany, and to the United States.
The cotton mills would help Britain become the greatest textile producer in the world. But what Ackroyd achieved here was far more than that, for Cromford was actually the world's first factory. Employees performed tightly defined tasks, working on rotation in 12-hour shifts. As canal mania began to sweep across Britain, the ageing Ackroyd joined other investors in a project to link Cromford to the growing centres of the Midlands. Throughout the 1800s, the wharves of the Cromford Canal echoed to the sound of coal barges, limestone barges, and the cotton industry. Today, conserved by the friends of the Cromford Canal, they seem a rather more tranquil place, although I have secured a meeting with their president.
Hey!
Tony! Nice to see you.
Lovely to see you, mate. Lovely to see you.
Well,
You're a Derbyshire lad, then?
Well, no, I'm not. I'm a Yorkshire lad. I come from about 30 miles. Maxborough, I was born over there.
Yeah.
And I used to come here on my holidays a lot. I went along all the canals.
I suppose when you think that Cromford would have been so isolated, suddenly, once it's got this canal, it's really linked with the outside world and the rest of the canal
That's
network,
right.
isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It'll go all the way to Irwash and beyond. It will be related to 2,000 miles of canals that are now linking up, kind of like a vertebrae, veins, etc., right across the country.
And what I'm highlighting, or what I'm wanting you to see in those clips, is the mechanical advantage. So you see this enlarged, lengthened, strengthened ability of humans to control and harness, to use energy, to manipulate and shape their world. And then there's this interesting example that I found when thinking about this topic, and that is an example from the telegraph system. So I'll maybe put up a little map this side, of the international telegraph cables by 1901. So this is this amazing proliferation. But thinking about this particular historical example, and if you think about the way that news could travel by horse or coach or foot or sailing clipper, that was the speed at which you could find out about something. But with sending telegrams, you could almost experience things in real time. You could respond, or at the beginning of the telegraph system, an event could take place on the other side of the world, and that same day you could make a decision or respond to that information in another part of the world. And there's this interesting little historical example that I found, and that is during one of the French revolutions, and there are a couple of them, one in 1848, not just the big famous one in the late 1700s, but then a revolution in 1848, sort of the year of revolutions around Europe, and then another one in 1871, and that was where you might have heard the phrase the Paris Commune. That was where that sort of came into being. And so you had these American ambassadors in place in both 1848 and 1871. And in 1848, the ambassador has to report by mail ship. And I'll put the link to this article that I found. But it's interesting reading about the way in which the ambassador he had to sort of use his own initiative and then report back. And then events would move very quickly. And so he wasn't sure whether or not the American government back in Washington, D.C., on the other side of the Atlantic, would support him recognising the new revolutionary government or not. And he kind of had to use his initiative and respond. And then and the gap in 1848 was about 6 weeks. So, so much could happen in that time. So he could ask a question, wait 6 weeks ask a question, be received in America, and then back again in 6 weeks. And so that's a long time to react, and basically he'd have to rely on his own initiative. And then it shifted by 1871 because of the transatlantic telegraph cable. The ambassador could then, on the same day, say, well, this has happened, there's been this revolution, what do you want me to do? And then get a response from Washington, D.C. And so no longer was the initiative of the local diplomatic official valued, but it was then about the centralized government. So Washington, D.C. then made the decision. And so the perception, the experience, the way in which the ambassador in Paris in 1848 experienced his world would be radically different to the ambassador in 1871. So there'd be this opportunity to respond quickly and convey the full, perception, weight, power of I've got this weird symbol thing, this thumb turned up. Anyway, I'll have to turn that off. Thinks I'm doing a thumbs up. Hopefully that won't come up on the video. If it does, sorry about that. So there's this change in perception, and that's what I'm trying to illustrate there with that little illustration. Now, thinking back now about the whole topic, before I want to wrap it up with a quote from Lord of the Rings, what Joseph Minich in Bulwarks of Unbelief is suggesting and arguing, and I think he argues for it convincingly, is there's not just a correlation between unbelief during the 1800s, where it moves from a fringe to a mainstream. So at the beginning of the 1800s, unbelief is fringe. By the end of the 1800s, it's mainstream, like a mainstream option. Even if it's not the sort of dominant feature of the culture, it's no longer a fringe option. What during that Victorian period changes, and he says it's not just a correlation between unbelief and the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution's the mechanisms of the Industrial Revolution, the way in which we're able to shape and change our world, changes the way in which we perceive the world. And I'll have to talk in another video about then how that change in agency, so our agency is diffused, we've both got more control, but then we become more passive and we pay attention less to how we participate. I'll have to talk in a future video about the way in which that then connects to unbelief. So let me finish with a quote from Lord of the Rings, and this is in that final, second to last chapter, The Scouring of the Shire. And so Tolkien, born in the late 1800s, would have, in his childhood, I think after they come back from South Africa, after his, I think it's either just before his mum dies, he's living in the country. His mum, after his dad dies, his mum returns to South Africa and then returns from South Africa to England. There's sort of this idyllic time in the country, and then they have to move into the town. And there's this sort of this contrast between the country and the town works its way out in English countryside. This experience of Tolkien works its way out in The Lord of the Rings. So the returning hobbits, as they crossed the bridge and looked up the hill, they gasped. Even Sam's vision in the mirror had not prepared him for what they saw. The old grange on the west side had been knocked down, and in its place taken by rows of tarred sheds. All the chestnuts were gone. The banks and the hedgerows were broken. The great wagons were standing in disorder in a field beaten bare of grass. Bagshot Row was a yawning sand and gravel quarry. Bag End up beyond could not be seen for a clutter of large huts. "They've cut it down," cried Sam. "They've cut down the party tree." He pointed to where the tree had stood under which Bilbo had made his farewell speech. It was lying lopped and dead in the field. As if this was the last straw, Sam burst into tears. Fantastic chapter, fantastic end to a fantastic book, but I think it brings out a little bit of that perception, that the perception of the way in which the world was changing that you see in both Tolkien and Lewis. If you've got a comment, love to read it, and I'll leave it there.